All right. Our first plenary address will be by Dr. Billy Christensen from the University of British Columbia. Dr. Christensen will draw lessons from experience with food web modeling, including how humans have impacted oceans. He will demonstrate some new approaches for fisheries communications to the public. His current research is focused on one question: will there be seafood and healthy oceans for the future generations? The work is conducted through the NERIUS Predicting the Future Ocean Program, which is a cooperative initiative of the Nippon Foundation and the University of British Columbia, with funding reaching up to $13 million. The NERIUS program develops global models to evaluate the impacts of fisheries and climate change on marine populations. The work involves participation in global initiatives that evaluate future scenarios for the world's oceans. Further, Dr. Christensen is the lead developer of EcoPath with EcoSim approach and software, which is used extensively throughout the world for ecosystem-based management of marine areas. He will base his talk is based on 20 years of experience working with ecological networks. Dr. Christensen is a professor at the UBC Fisheries Center and director of the Nippon Foundation, UBC NERIUS program. Please help me in welcoming Billy Christensen.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming this early in the morning, even those in the background. And when I got this task from Bill of looking at networks, I was a little bit puzzled because I knew that I've been working a lot with networks, but in the later years I somehow moved on. So for me, this was an opportunity to look at the field, re-examine it, and there has really been incredible amount of progress in this area, especially in theoretical ecology. So it was really an eye-opener to go through that. But it's also one where I very quickly realized that there was no way I could give justice to that development in 30 minutes. So what I did was to focus on what Bill asked me to focus on, ecological networks and fisheries. So focus on how can we use networks, and that includes food webs, in fisheries. And that's what I intend to do then in this presentation. And the presentation is going to take you through a journey that in a way is my professional career, because this is what I've been working with in the last decades. And I will start there, as we've done in fisheries, with single species assessment. And even though I'm introducing to you networks and ecosystem-based management in essence, this is the foundation for fisheries management, and we will continue to do that. We're not going to stop making single-species assessments. They are the foundation for tactical management, for how we manage the resources this year, the opening of the season, kind of things that the governor talked about. What we have to add to that is, however, fish eat fish. No fish is an island. So this matters in the medium to long term. Where do we want to be 5 years from now? That's the kind of question where the networks come in. And this has indeed been studied now for, say 40, 50 years or longer, but only gradually is it finding its way into assessments and into the managing of fisheries. And as soon as we start recognizing that fish eat fish, we also have to recognize that there is a basis for it, a food basis. That brings us to planktonic food webs or benthic food sources. And as soon as we go that way, the next step is the environment. We have to consider how fisheries are impacted by environment. And one of the key questions there is what rules? The changes that we see in ecosystems, are they caused by fisheries? Is it us humans who are making the changes, or is it the environment? And traditionally, this is something that has been studied in different buildings. In the marine world, the oceanographers are in one place, and the fishery scientist is somewhere else, and they really don't talk very much. There's a total lack of networks, and there has been that for a long time. And this is one of the issues where I see we really have to make changes. And this is indeed going to be the key aspect of my presentation. How do we build those networks? The networks that are necessary for us to understand what happens in the ecosystem. We cannot do that if we continue the disciplinary approach that has ruled up to now. But let me take a step backwards. Oh, there was too many steps forward. Let me take a step backward here and acknowledge Raymond Lindemann. He was a pioneer in trophic dynamics, introducing trophic dynamics, introducing that when we look at ecosystems and we look at food webs, we have to look at energy flows and not just the Eltonian numbers. Now, Raymond Lindemann was actually born in Redwood Falls, some 100 miles west of here, and he was educated at the University of Minnesota, right here in the Twin Cities. So as such, it's a, I think, very, what's the word for it? It's very suitable, that's a small word for it, to introduce him here. What he did was he studied the Cedar Creek bog in Minnesota very intensively for his PhD in the late 30s. He measured everything from ooze in the middle here to bacteria to phytoplankton up to the piscivores in the system. Got numbers for them, and he expressed everything as energy. He put that into a mathematical model, and he set the groundwork for looking at things like trophic levels, energy transfer, and not pyramids was another thing, energy pyramids. And he did all of that with a background of understanding thermodynamics, introducing that as well. And as such, he was a true pioneer whose work has inspired generations since that. And that's in spite of him dying only at the age of 27, just after his PhD work was published. Really incredible. It led to many other things, including to the International Biological Program that ran from 64 to 74, a major international activity with study sites throughout the world. And this work was mainly descriptive, with some exceptions, though, that I will return to later in this presentation. One thing that followed from it was actually a big study in Hawaii, where over 5 years up in the Western Hawaiian Islands, they studied everything that moved, the whole food web, all the organisms, and they measured all the rates in the system. And after some years, they realized, what do we do with this messing of data that we have here? The answer was, hire a modeler. So they hired Jeff Polovina, a young guy just out of grad school, and he became the modeler that was to make an ecosystem model of the French Frigate Shoals, to put things together, sort out all this mess, and make sense of the numbers. That's actually what modelers do, try to make sense out of measurements and numbers and data. So he looked around, he went to Taibu up in Alaska. No, he was actually in Washington, in Seattle, but he was working with Alaska on the Bering Sea. And he talked to the Anderson-Racine group in the North Sea, that's my home, and they were doing a big North Sea model, 2 big complex models. And he realized that was way too complicated. With all the species that he had in Hawaii, there was no way he could get into those details. So he extracted the essence of Leivastu's model, and he put that together in what's called a mass balance model. That became the Epipart model, and he published it, and he moved on. But the Ecopart model is what we have been working with, many of us people since then. It has actually been recognized by NOAA as one of the 10 biggest scientific breakthroughs in its history, 150-year history, just a few years ago. It's a mass balance model. So what it does is it measures for each group in the system energy in, energy out, and tries to balance that. And it does that across the whole ecosystem. In doing so, we create, with these models, a snapshot of the ecosystem. What was in the ecosystem at a given point in time, and that's about it. What was there and how did it interact? That's our snapshot of the ecosystem. I have been developing ecoparts for more than 2 decades. And one of the first things I did was a meta-analysis of ecosystems, where I used Polovina's ecopart model and combined it with network analysis in order to get a PhD. And it was actually quite interesting. And one thing I would like to highlight here is the work on ecosystem development. This is inspired by one of the greatest ecologists of all times, E.P. Odom. He described how ecosystems would move from being very immature system and all development stages. And he put attributes on it, like numbers for what's the ratio between system production and respiration, how does that change? That kind of numbers. This is actually work that also was inspired by Raymond Lindemann's work on succession and the importance of thermodynamics here. So I did that for some 40 systems, and out of it came a ranking of ecosystems. And to me, as a PhD student, I found that really intriguing, that you were able to rank ecosystem based on these messy food webs, extract a few numbers, and out you can get a ranking of which system is more mature than other system. I found that really interesting, puzzling in many ways. When it comes to working with it and using it in fisheries, that's more of a challenge though. But it's almost like reality what you get out of this. This is typical indicator work. You score systems on a number of criteria, and you work with how do you turn that into the overall ranking. Who gets up on top? Who survives in this system? That's the questions we're asking with this. And you can get really beautiful pictures out of this. And there are lots of pictures and attributes and approaches and theoretical ecology that we can look at. And recently we've seen all these fancy 3D food webs that you can twist them around, and you can use cluster analysis, and you can get that these ones rank and these one there. It can be really beautiful. And again, how do you use that in fisheries? That is a big challenge. It's also one where you have the impression sometimes that if you want to make your mark in this field, you have to come up with your own indicators and your own approaches for this. There's very little consensus on it. Even though I'm a Dane, I'm not going to compare it to the Emperor's New Clothes, because there is actually something really fundamental behind it. But it's a big challenge for those working with network analysis to come to an applied field like ours and then give guidance for how we use it. I think that's a challenge that we have to push on to those working with it, that how do we actually use this? We heard about the zebra mussels. Now, are there ways that we can predict, based on this network analysis, which species are likely to be the invaders? Which species are likely to be the one that would be suffering as we are entering the age of climate change? That's the kind of questions that we need to use for it. But I have really been puzzled many times and struggled with this. What does it mean when I look at all these indicators that comes out of network analysis? Actually, quite often, I come to think about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or more specifically to the third of the 5 volumes in the trilogy, the one called Life, the Universe, and Everything. And if you don't remember that one, let me just refresh your memory here. As you'll know, the Earth is really was really a big supercomputer operated by the mice. And it toiled on for millions of years to answer the most fundamental question about life, the universe, and everything. And one day the answer came. And of course the answer is 42. Now, that's the problem I've had sometimes in network analysis. It gives me the answer, but I don't know the question. What does these indicators actually tell us? What comes out of it? That is one of the questions that we have to deal with when we work with network analysis. and asking for consensus, and that is on work and people working together on that is really a fundamental aspect of this, something that's missing. We need to build network also between the network scientists. That's critical for it to be applied. Now, one thing I'm also missing in the network analysis that is predominant today is dynamics. They tend to be focused on snapshots, looking at the kind of pictures I showed you before of the food web and then drawing out the numbers from it. That's what I found really intriguing about this work when I was a PhD student, that you could do that. You can get these numbers out, and with the tools I had at the time, that was a good use of it. But this was 20 years ago. Dynamics adds another dimension. And this is something that's recognized in its National Biological Program, in its productivity subgroup. In that subgroup, they hired a lot of brand new, quantitative young scientists who could work with computers to introduce dynamic models. So models of how ecosystem was impacted by the environment, in the food web, and by human impact. They created nice models. And in essence, what they did was to take the snapshot that I talked about before and turn it into a movie where things would change over time. And from a modeling perspective, the really intriguing part of that is that it adds constraints on the parameters. It's no longer so that we don't just have the snapshot. And when it comes to interpreting it, you can all think about the difference between interpreting a picture and interpreting a movie. In the movie, you might have seen who killed who, so you don't need to make all the guesses. You have more constraints when you get the dynamics into it. So that was really a major contribution of the International Biological Program. The problem, however, was the models did not behave that they worked with in the IPP. They are typical thermodynamic models, mass action models, the Lotka-Voltaire models that some of you may remember from ecology lessons in grad school or earlier, actually, throughout the university you had in ecology. These mass balance models, these thermodynamic models, mass action models, the way they work is like the Lotka-Voltaire model. You have a number of predators, you multiply that with a number of prey, and then you multiply on that a search rate, a constant. So more predators means more consumption by a predator. More prey means more consumption by that predator again. Now that's pure logic if you're a chemical engineer, for sure. But in biology, there are some problems with that. They work fine in very simple systems. So if you have, say, an Arctic system, you have some prey, lots of prey, and you have a predator. There's lots of prey, so the predator eats, and the prey goes down, and you get into wild cycles. The models, the Lotka-Voltaire models, can do that. What they have problems with is if you have an ecosystem, lots of species, maybe even species that look alike, then these models tend to self-simplify. That's what you see here. They will self-simplify, so you cannot have 5 species that are quite similar. 4 will die out very quickly. And that was the problem that they were facing in systems analysis, these bright young kids, scientists, that they could not get the models to behave. So basically, over the years, they left the field, one after the other. That includes my colleague Carl Walters. He was one of these bright young scientists that was recruited by the IBP to work on modeling. And he gave up on the models and he moved into fisheries, more practical aspect. And so you'll know him as he was recognized, I think, last year for this work here at AFS. Now, Carl was out fishing one day with his son on a beautiful lake in BC on a day like we have today. And just like the governor, when you go fishing with Carl, you don't catch. I just spent actually 3 days out on a boat with Carl and Buzz Harling and Steve Carpenter. And we caught enough in 3 days in BC for one appetizer. So that's just a rule. You have to recognize that. We go fishing, we don't go catching, even though we try hard, just like the governor. So sitting out there when you're 9-year-old out in this lake and fishing for big trout. Now, you get bored. So Will looked over the side of the boat and he saw a lot of nice Daphnia swimming around. Daphnia pulic, cadoshans, big, nice fish food. I'm not a native speaker, so you know what I mean now, right? Daphnia pulics, yeah, they are really great food for a child, for small trout. So Will ask the obvious question. Why don't the fish eat them all, Dad? And Carl, just like that, he gave the obvious answer. We are fishing for the big trout. They are out here in the open part of the lake. Now, the small trout don't want to be eaten by the big trout, so they are hiding up there on the shallows where it's warm and where the big trouts won't go. And they only come out here feeding at night, and they are the ones that will eat the Daphnia. It's not the big ones. The big ones want the small trout. I mean, any biologist in this room would give that answer, right? I mean, it's so obvious. Just like when you have an aquarium, you put in, no, I won't go there. This is obvious. But afterwards, when they rowed back ashore again, Carl came to think, this was actually really profound what he had said. Why didn't they include that in the modeling? Why wasn't there this behavioral aspect included in the modeling? So what he did was he designed the foraging arena. And the foraging arena is something we all know as biologists from, say, a coral reef ecosystem. When you look at a coral reef ecosystem, you see the swarm of beautiful red antias and all the other fish. Small fish, they're close to the reef. The bigger planktivores, they're all planktivores, those you see there, they go further away. And they're all sitting there competing with each other, waiting for the currents, the advection to bring plankton to them. They don't go out hunting out there in the open, because they'll be eaten if they go out there. Suddenly, you have that roaming predator coming by, a piscivore, coming by, barracuda, whatever it is, and all the fish, the swarms just disguise, they disappear into the reef. They are not available. So you go out there and you measure the amount of plankton, or you measure the amount of fish. Should be plenty for everyone. There isn't. The normal stomach in the sea is an empty stomach, because fish are afraid. Fish are scared. They don't take a chance. It's much better to eat tomorrow than to be eaten today yourself. And the things are connected. If you take a risk, you go out, eat, bang. You're taking a risk when you go out there. You're vulnerable. So to get that into the modeling, what we have to do, to get this foraging arena in, what we have to do is just to recognize prey can be in different behavioral states. And if we just split it out between prey being available or not available to predation, then we can still use the Lotka-Volterra models for that. We just need to add this to it. The moment we do that, the models start behaving. On technical term, it's radio dependence we put into it. But the moment we do it, it makes a big difference. So here's one example. British Columbia, back home there. We modeled the ecosystem, and there are 20 or something different time series. And we tried to fit the model to it. It was actually quite feasible. So we could replicate the history of the system by incorporating food web effects and fishing effects, or fishing pressure, plus the environment. So in this case here, we didn't put in the environment. We let the computer, we optimized for what should system productivity be over time to maximize the fit. And what came out of that was something that was very consistent with measured estimates for environment. We've done the same now in lots of different ecosystems. And from this, we learned that in order to explain the history of ecosystems, what has happened there in big, complex ecosystem models, we have to include what happens in the food web, the networks there, how species interact. fish eat fish. But we also need to have the impact of the environment, and we need to understand the human impact, notably through fisheries. This is fundamental. With this, we reach the point where we can replicate the history in a very credible way. This opens up for us answering these important questions, what-if questions. Who did it? What was the role of the environment versus the ecosystem's effects and the humans? And it's not always the usual suspect that's behind the changes we see. Now, with this background, if we can make predictions of this kind, we actually have the opportunity to start talking about how is the world going to look tomorrow, the future food webs. And in doing so, and that's what, well, we heard from Bill Fisher when he introduced me about the nearest programs. I won't go into detail with that. But I'll give you a few slides though. And a key issue for the work we're doing there is to ask the questions of, will there be seafood and a healthy ocean for future generations to enjoy? And to answer that question, we have to take the step from, yes, we can replicate the past, to making predictions. And it's also quite clear, think about what the governor said of where you get seafood from now, that when we're doing this, we can't just look at a state or a country, because seafood is being traded international. It has to be at the global level. That's what the problem is. And of course, when the Nippon Foundation came to us and suggested a partnership on this, it was out of concern for, are we running out of seafood? What do we have to do in order to make sure that there will be seafood for the coming generations? That's an important task of us to give guidance on that. And for that, we need to go in and we need to start thinking about making predictions. So in this activity, we are working on global issues, so global modeling, but doesn't really change it. What's important here is that we formed a partnership which includes Princeton and Duke universities, Cambridge, Stockholm, and UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center. And jointly in this group, we span from biogeochemical models, lower trophic level models, upper trophic level models, governance issue, marketing issues. And that is necessary in order to even address this question. So here we have actually the networks coming in, the kind of networks we need in order to ask questions. We cannot go in and just do this based, got a yellow light here, must be getting close. It's scary. But actually we are on time. No, we need to make these predictions. It is really fundamental for our profession that we take that step and we make predictions. We have to move there. From the modeling point of view, one thing we have to realize is that these models are data hungry and they need to be fed well. Feeding them well means adding constraints to the model. It makes the modeling better. But we actually know a lot and we need to make that available. So for the global models, we've been building global data layers now for the last 10, 12, 15 years that we are adding as food for the modeling. So now we are at the stage where we're starting to make beautiful music. We stand up there and we make predictions and we get great symphonies about, well, everything moves in synchrony. You can hear the zooplankton popping and the small pelagics and everything. We know how to do it. At least it would be great if we could do that. I don't think we will ever be able to make those beautiful symphonies. That is just music to my ear. Probably not. I think there are two reasons for that. One is we don't know enough about ecosystems and how they work. And the other is the vampires in the basement. And I'm going to introduce you to both of them. The first thing about us not knowing enough, that's a critical realization. We may have good models, we may be able to replicate the history of the ecosystems, but when it comes to making predictions, there's just things we don't know. Fundamental for that is adaptive management. We have to monitor what's out there. We have to do experiments. And we have to learn from those experiments and adapt to it. And all of this must be guided by sensible monitoring. Sensible modeling, I should know that word by now. It's used at least 4 times. We need to understand we need to be guided by sensible modeling. Here I go again. For this, that will help us avoid the gross errors, and it will guide the monitoring and will tell us the kind of experience. And this is nothing new, of course. This has been around with Holling and with Carl Walters and other adaptive management for 40 years, but it has not been picked up enough. This is a very fundamental aspect for us making better model. So that's one aspect of what is behind it. And the other thing that stops us from these beautiful symphonies is what Carl Walters, I think I mentioned him before, but once more. Carl Walters talks about the vampire in the basement. That's the thing that comes up and bites you out of the blue. Expect the unexpected. There are things we cannot predict in the ecosystem, and it will come and bite us. Behavior has a lot to do with that. And behavior in ecological systems is just as complex to predict as it is in social systems. I think, Barb, you'll be talking about that in a few minutes. So that's the key issue, behavior and how that impacts us. But in spite of that, we as fishery scientists have to go out and we have to start making predictions, as you see in my last slide here. The challenge here to the managers is define objectives. Where do you want to go? Where do you want us to take you? That has to be made very clear, and it's not always. It's a fundamental thing, and it should be a very clear thing. We have to make it clear what our objectives are, what we want to do. And the second thing here is we have to make choices, and we have to focus our research so that we enable our community, ourselves, to make policy choices. That is a critical aspect. And with that, I would like to thank, first of all, Dalai Felinto for what you've seen here, Carl Walters and colleagues, and Bill too, for discussions that led to this. Thank you very much.